Oh, are we live? Harry, we're live. Somebody, let me just ask if the audio's working here. Can you hear me? Excuse me. Unrelated. I'm just, have a bit of cat hair in my lungs. It is 3 o'clock. I have 5 viewers, but that's all right. The YouTube stream is going to stay live. Hi, Harry. It is going to be live for about an hour. Then the video is going to be saved on YouTube. Hello, thank you. Yes, the stream is live, and you can hear me. This is Harry. I don't know if he's going to stick around. How is everyone doing today? No coughing? It's unrelated, I swear. It's the kitty cat. Okay, so it's week 11. We're slowly wrapping up the class. I've had to make some modifications to the plan because we're going online. So let's talk about that. Oh. Insert link. Yes, I should have done that. Just as a reminder, here's our new schedule. The revision assignment, so we're talking about this Friday. Part 2 has been canceled. Just revise the thing, submit it on FOL, you're done. The part where you bring it to class and I print it out and we work on each other's revisions, unfortunately, has been cut. On week 11th, which is this week, so I'm hoping to see that summary assignment so I can start grading it. That's going to be April 3rd, Friday. Then after that, it's your research report. Friday, April 10th, a week after that. And then you're going to turn that research report into an individual presentation. Your individual presentation should consist of 2 elements. One, a PowerPoint, like a slideshow. And a second element, your narration, which can take the form of a screen capture, a video taken with your smartphone, or just a Word document with your narration included. And I don't think we can see the cat anymore. Hold on. There we go. Can we see? Where's the cat? What a good kitty. So if you have any questions or concerns about this new schedule, please let me know. Otherwise, I'm just going to proceed as planned with today's content. You'll be glad to know I am currently grading your employment packages. They look pretty good. I just need to finish. I'm a little bit behind on my grading. There's been a lot of work transitioning these classes to online classes, working from home with 2 kids, 2 cats, and everything is also not obvious, but we're doing our best. So let's get started. Everyone's okay? Good. So let's talk teamwork and people skills. Usually what I do for this class is I kind of break it up into a number of distinct topics. Talk about the phases, talk about working in groups. The reason I talk about working in groups is usually under the normal parameters of the class. You would be working in groups to turn research reports into presentations. Part of the assignment is to choose which of the group's research reports to turn into a presentations. Now, of course, because we're going online, things are pretty different. We are going to be instead working on individual reports. So some of this kind of team building, group work content is going to seem less directly relevant to this specific iteration of the class. However, in the future, you will absolutely be asked to work in groups. You will be asked to work in teams. And just as public speaking, which we talked about last week, is a really critical soft skill to have, maybe the most critical, another critical skill is the ability to effectively work in teams. So that's what I will be talking about today. Now, team development at least according to one business communications textbook. I would go get it, but then I would disturb the cat, and you can't disturb a cat. Can you? Can you disturb a cat? Who is it that wanted to see the cats? Oh, I disturbed the cat. Somebody wanted to see the cats. So at least according to there it is. At least according to business communication now, there are 4 phases of team building. These phases are as follows. We have you first form the team. Then once the team is formed, you enter the brainstorming phase. Once brainstorming is done, you know what to do. You start norming, and then finally performing. So you form the team, you start brainstorming how to proceed, you start implementing that, and once you figured out how to implement things, you can just start performing and working together as a team. Let's look at those 4 phases in a little more detail. So when you form the team, you begin by selecting the appropriate members, and you become acquainted with each other in order to hopefully build trust and form a collaborative culture, a culture where everybody has an understanding of their roles in the team, how they're going to kind of just interface, how you're going to interact with each other, and figure out how you're going to work together and collaborate. So this kind of first phase is just kind of when you meet people. The second phase, brainstorming, is after you've sort of gotten acquainted with people, you've learned how you're going to interact, you're going to collaborate and do the following things. You're going to start in the group identifying the problem you're trying to solve. You're going to collect and share information, and you're going to start establishing how your criteria in terms of decision making, and in terms of also kind of determining whether or not you've made progress, and finally you're going to start prioritizing your goals. That's the second phase of forming a team. Now, suppose you were doing the original assignment structure, which is you get together in groups and you turn one of your research reports into a presentation. Just imagine yourself in a scenario. You're with 2 or 3 of your course mates. You've selected members of your team. You looked around and said, hey, do you want to be on a group with me? You become acquainted. Maybe you're already friends, right? You just got to get a sense, is this person actually going to do the work, or am I going to have to do all the work? You're trying to build trust. And then in the brainstorming phase, you start by identifying the problems or the things you need to do. If you need to choose a group member's report to turn into a presentation, the first thing you need to do is, well, figure out how are we going to choose. Are we going to just like show everyone's reports, compare your grades? You're going to share the information. For example, here's my report. What do you think of this one? Establish decision criteria. How are we going to choose which report to present? Prioritize goals. Once we've chosen, what are we going to do? We're going to need to figure out how to present this thing. Are we going to break it down by sections? Who's going to do what? What speaking rules are going to be assigned? So this is when you start figuring out the problem. Now, step 3, after you're done forming and brainstorming in your team, you'll be norming, setting norms and moving forward. Maybe you could discuss some alternative ways of doing things. You could start evaluating the outcomes, figuring out how you're going to do that, apply some criteria, prioritize which alternatives you're going to do. So in a way, you're just taking your ideas and you're making them more concrete in order to move on to the performing stage. You're implementing the plan, you're just managing the project at that point. So when you're working in groups, let me just look at the chat box here. Again, if you have any questions about anything, I am looking at that chat box. You can always send me an email afterwards. I'm going to try to keep this to about an hour or so. The cat escaped. So when you're establishing a group dynamic, right, in the first part, the forming part, often people kind of neglect the forming the team part of the story, because there are a lot of pitfalls to the process of forming your team, right? You know, even sometimes, even if there's someone who's supposed to be in charge, maybe you just have someone on your team as a personality where they just talk more. Maybe somebody starts dominating all decision making. So if you're thinking about what it is to be a good leader in a team situation, it's not just about dominating the situation. It's not just about telling people what to do. It's also about, it's really about ensuring smooth cooperation between all the team members, right? You're more of a traffic cop, right? You're more saying like, you need to stop, this person needs to start talking. And the temptation is going to be like rushing through this process or just letting it settle naturally. But I think people should be really conscious of the forming part, right? Um, you should really take the time necessary to kind of have a cohesive unit happening and be just really consciously aware of like, is this person really a leader, or are they just somebody that talks a lot? There's clearly a difference here. Braden says, can you play something on the sweet 6-string sitting there? The acoustic here. I could probably play literally any Smashing Pumpkins songs off the top of my head. So type in your request in the chat box for early, like not any, like we'll call it the '90s era Smashing Pumpkins. So put in your request there, and we'll see what I can do. In phase 2, all right, once we've established a group dynamic, we're really taking more time to define our roles and responsibilities. We decide what goals we should be reaching, how to reach them, and what are the rules kind of governing the interaction. Now, at this point, conflict is really normal. Like low-key conflict is normal in group interaction. The question is how you're going to resolve that conflict. Now, culturally speaking, there's different approaches to conflict resolution. Uh, some scholars mark a big distinction between individualistic cultures like North America and then more collectivist cultures, often found in Southeast Asia and Japan. Individualists tend to resolve conflict directly and in public by giving arguments for their positions. Some people are uncomfortable with this. They resolve conflicts indirectly, outside of the group situation, by convincing people and building coalitions and smoothing over the conflict before the group comes together. Both of these ways are pretty good ways of dealing with conflict. People manage disagreements differently. What you don't want is a situation where there's meta-conflict, where you're not aware that there's different conflict resolution strategies occurring, and then there's conflict over the fact that you don't know how to deal with conflict. Somebody who is a very direct person might get mad at the person who has a more indirect approach. So take a step back and think, how do I as a person approach conflict? Do I try to smooth things out behind the scenes, or do I confront it directly? How do other people deal with conflict in my group? And how do I meet them halfway? Not to win, but to just be productive. That's the question. How about some gin blossoms? I'd have to look up the chords. That's been a long time. I don't think I should be playing guitar during course time, however. Maybe next week. This week was cat week. So really the question is whether conflict is productive. Right? If conflict is being productive, then you're avoiding problems that occur when there's not enough conflict, right? When there's not enough disagreement or productive discussion, right? There could be a failure to check out alternatives, a failure involving self-censorship, where people are afraid to say, hey, I don't think this is working, where you're not getting enough information, where decision-making, right, isn't actually reflecting group consensus, but rather a dominant personality. When there might be poor risk management, right? So conflict is bad when it's hostile, when it's deadlocked, when it feels stressful, when you're not consciously applying strategies that help you resolve the conflict. That's when it's bad conflict. It's useful conflict when you're actually talking about alternatives, when you're actually giving different sources of information, when you're actually engaged in cooperative decision making. In fact, good conflict shouldn't feel like conflict at all. So part of doing this will involve, of course, when you're forming a team, is kind of like deciding how you're going to decide stuff. It's a little bit paradoxical. How do you decide how to decide if you haven't decided how to decide already? It's weird. But here are some options, right? Some groups can just go by majority rule, show of hands. It could be consensus. Everyone has to agree in order to proceed. I used to hang out with a bunch of anarchists in my undergrad, and anarchist decision making was usually based on consensus. So we would vote, and it would never be a majority. Generally, we had to reach consensus, or you couldn't decide. Generally speaking, we'd actually have a three-tiered system of voting. Somebody would say, "I agree with it," so I'm contributing to the consensus. "I disagree and I don't consent," which means that you don't have consensus. Or there's a middle vote, and the middle vote is, "I'm not sure I like this, but I don't want to break consent necessarily, but I wish we would talk about it more." So you can say, so this is like, I'm not consenting, but I'm not enthusiastically endorsing this either. There's kind of the middle ground. So the group could proceed as long as you got no thumbs down. So that's in case you ever wondered how anarchists decided things. Why were you hanging out with anarchists? That's a story for another class. There's also the idea of the minority report, which is where you ask members of your team to report back, to do research and come back with a suggestion about what to do, and you just do what the experts say. So you delegate decision making to a smaller group. Averaging or negotiated compromise. You can have, if you have conflict between two different views, you try to do a middle ground thing, or you have an outside agent that acts as a mediator. I find there's just authority rule. There's just one leader, and they're the decider. You put the options in front of them, and the group leader says, "This is the one I want to do." So there's different ways. I'm assuming if you're working in groups in your other classes, you're probably going to go through something like majority or consensus. You're just going to talk it out. But in the back of your minds, I want you to be thinking about how you're talking it out and what the decisions actually are looking like as a function of you guys talking it out. I have some slides here about failures in group reasoning. I think I'm going to skip them this time around. You can look at the slides; they're posted online. It's just slides about how decision making can go wrong in groups, groupthink when controversy is avoided, cliches when people says, "Well, everybody's entitled to their opinion," which doesn't actually say anything; it just kind of shuts things down. So you can look at those slides. So in step 2, and partially in step 3 as well, how are you going to be prioritizing and making your goals? That's a great question. So any goal you make as a group in a team needs to be concrete and really measurable. And if you don't have concrete, measurable goals, then it'll be really hard to track people's workflows, and it'll be hard to hold people accountable to the decisions made in the group. Vague goals are generally bad. So if you tell a group member, "I think you should work on this section," I mean, that's kind of okay, but it could be a bit more concrete, right? What you need to say is like, "This section needs 3 slides. Slides A, B, and C. Can you get those slides in by Tuesday?" All right, so we have something that's really concrete, all right, with a deadline, and is measurable. 3 slides by Tuesday when we're meeting next. Right? The more specific your goals are, the easier they are to implement. And the more measurable they are, the more it's easy to determine if your workflow is working or not. Because if you have a goal without a metric of success, it's not really a goal, it's an aspiration. And if you're not sure how to do this, right, because if the goal is just like finish the presentation, that's too big. It's not measurable, it's not concrete, it's vague. You should break down this larger goal into smaller subtasks, and I'll be talking more about this next week. Think about the order, right? You can't prioritize if you can't prioritize some end goal if you need to go through some steps first, right? That might mean as you're breaking down your goals, make sure it can be reassembled at the end. So just think about all these things when you're working on your goals. So let me just look at the chat box here. The slides will be in the content folder as well as the stream, absolutely. In fact, they should be there right now. If I'm wrong about that, please let me know, and I will edit the content folder. It should be right now in week 11's content folder. Okay, so by the third stage, you're done brainstorming, right? So the conflict period really should subside and everybody is working on goals, right? You're sharing information, you're providing feedback, you're making decisions, and you're making some progress. In the fourth stage, right, you have a really good working routine and you don't require a great deal of supervision, right? Everybody's a bit more autonomous in their work and you're just kind of performing as a group unconsciously. So, so norming and performing are very similar stages, um, and performing is kind of the unconscious excellence aspect of group forming, where you're not consciously making decisions anymore. You're just kind of performing and doing the thing. Um, so how do we make sure that we successfully navigate the four stages of group work, from the initial stage of forming a team to the performing, which is the part where you're just doing it and you don't need to have these kind of lengthy meta discussions about how you're going to do it anymore. The thing you need to do to go through these four stages is to manage your roles, manage the functional roles, and especially manage the dysfunctional roles. Team problems when you're working in groups are usually one of these, right? So a team problem might be confusion, very common. People just don't know what they're supposed to be doing, and they're waiting direction. They're just idle. Or they've been given a task and they don't really understand the task, and they're just going to press hold until the next meeting. Maybe they don't even know who they're supposed to talk to about clarification. So confusion could just make things grind to a halt. Mismatch, people working at cross purposes. I thought I was working on Section A. No, I'm working at Section A. Now we have two Section A's. Bad leadership, right? So the leader could be inconsistent. Whoever is in the leadership role could be too tentative. Maybe there is no leader, and then one person is kind of begrudgingly taking on the mantle of telling people what to do. Or maybe they're a little too much into being the leader, and they're just discouraging discussion and being too authoritarian, right? You really need that kind of, being a good leader is neither shouting at people nor up talking all the time, right? You are really trying to make sure productivity occurs. That's your only job as a team leader. Sometimes if you're working in an organization, you're assigned to teams, but the organization isn't really committed to the idea of teamwork. For example, I've worked at companies where you're supposed to work as a team, but only one person, usually the senior person, ends up getting all the rewards and accolades, and the actual members of the team are just kind of forgotten by the end of the project, and that really sucks. So why work in a team? Sometimes you can also have just poor feedback, right? You're working and then you don't know if you're succeeding or not, usually because of unclear goals. So these are all team problems you can have. So how do we avoid these team problems? Well, I'm going to talk about the idea of group roles. So there's this really nice article way back in the prehistoric time of 1948. A couple of industrial psychologists, Benny and Sheets, Benny and the Sheets, wrote a short article entitled Functional Roles of Group Members. And what they were doing in this article is they tried to give an account of the typical roles that group members can take when they're in a group environment. The authors give, like, here's 26 different roles group members might end up playing in group dynamics. Some of them are functional roles, some of them are dysfunctional roles. So the idea is you should discourage dysfunctional roles. Dysfunction, of course, being the opposite of function, so it's roles that get in the way of teamwork. And functional roles, which are the ones that help. But you need to have the helpful roles at the right time. So your job as a leader is to do two things. You discourage dysfunction, and you recruit the appropriate function. Right, this isn't a personality thing. Different personalities can find themselves doing different group roles as a function of context. Really think of this as a functional dysfunctional thing. Things people do in groups. And you'll probably recognize some of these, actually. So Benny and Sheets kind of break up functional roles into task and social roles. So let's talk about task roles. All right, these are roles about accomplishing tasks in the group. All right, any one person could take up one or more of these roles. So what you might want in a team is the initiator, right? The one who proposes ideas or ways of approaching group problems or goals. An initiator is really useful because they're the person that can kind of get the ball rolling. Now, the initiator isn't always the most precise person. They're not always going to be someone who's very detail-oriented. They're the person that has big ideas, and they don't want to get stuck in the details. But that's great, because if nobody gets the ball rolling, the detail-oriented person has nothing to work with. I love initiators in my classrooms when I'm talking, right? That one kid that always goes like, because that's energy in the classroom you need to just get the ball rolling. You gotta shut down the initiator eventually. You don't need 5 original ideas. You just need 1 to work on. But that's a really important task. Who likes to do the research part, right? So initiators, information seekers, and givers. We also have people that look for the values and attitudes of the group, people who give their opinions about what's happening in the group. So, right, just because you have information, somebody could say like, "Hey, look, how do we feel about this proposal?" And then the opinion giver might go, "Actually, I worry about this." So these are really important roles. And if you don't see these roles happening, the job of a good leader isn't to take the role and be that person necessarily. The job of a leader is to recruit the role. You can go like, "Hey, Kyle, I haven't heard from you recently. What's your take?" Right? You just recruit the role that's missing in your group. The elaborator, this is from Benny and Sheets' 1948 article. These are the actual roles they point out as who you need in a group situation, right? The elaborator can take other people's ideas and builds on them, right? The coordinator could identify and explain the relationship between ideas, right? And again, if you have too many people being initiators and not enough elaborators, you need to shut the initiator down for a bit and recruit an elaborator or be the elaborator. I'm not going to read all of these. There's quite a few. You can look at the slides if you like. So when you're working in groups, right, you might need somebody whose job is to just kind of orient people, get them back on track. Might need somebody who's just an energizer, somebody who's able to stimulate the group to take action, somebody who pushes the group forward. The procedural person, right, who takes care of any kind of logistical concerns. Right, maybe they're the one booking the room, maybe the one sending all the emails, right? And also, apart from task roles, you have social roles. And these also you either have to encourage, discourage, or recruit, or just embody. Social roles include somebody just encouraging, right? It's really nice to have someone in a group that's going like, "That's a good idea, thank you for bringing that up," right? Because that could help the group feel like they're not stuck. The harmonizer, right, conciliates differences. That's the person that's kind of the in-between of two opposing points. It's able to stop and say, "Look, we need to figure this problem out." Right, we have the observer, provides feedback to the group about how it's functioning. Right, the compromiser, willing to yield positions, meet others halfway, which is really important. So if you have a group embroiled in a big disagreement about decision making, the first person to be able to say, "Actually, here's a compromise," might lead the group to working better together. Let's talk dysfunctional roles finally. The last thing I want to talk about in the Benny and Sheets section here. Again, the idea here is that as you're working in teams, you want to not get stuck at any stage of the group process, and eventually you want to just get to the performing stage. To get to the performing stage, you need to make sure you have all the right roles in your group at the right time. That when you need new ideas, you need to have an initiator. When we need more information, you need to make sure that somebody's out there doing that job of getting the information. We also need to watch out for dysfunctional roles. Now, dysfunctional roles in groups often take take one of these kind of patterns here, and I think everybody's familiar. Everybody's seen people who act like this. Right, a dysfunctional role, something you want to discourage, something you don't want to see in your group, is someone like an aggressor, who, whenever you have an idea, the initiator says something. It could be a little bit vague, but that's fine. just says, "Ah, that's ridiculous." All right. Usually that's a status-seeking behavior. Somebody's trying to increase their status by lowering someone else's. Right. Right. If somebody's not offering actual constructive criticism, um, but it's content-free, like insults, right. The leader should shut that down immediately. Blocker just opposes every idea. The group stalls because it can't get past resistance. Somebody just no, I don't think this can work. I don't think this can work. No, I disagree. But not willing to. Then you need to find a compromiser in your group. You need to turn the blocker into a compromiser. You need to turn somebody to initiator to get new ideas, or you need to get that dysfunctional role under control. Recognition seeker, right? Somebody who uses the group context just to draw attention to themselves. Whatever. Uh, Whenever somebody is just trying to do something irrelevant in your group context, right? You're acting silly, you're making noise, directing people's attention away from the task at hand, they're joking. That can be good for morale to a point, but generally speaking, you're going to want to, if it's disruptive to productivity, watch out for the recognition seeker. Um, Other dysfunctional roles, just quickly, we got the self-confessor. Right? That reminds me of a time when, this is me, by the way, my dysfunction is I'm a self-confessor in the classroom. Um, I always disclose my personal feelings on issues by just talking about my cats or whatever. So I try to get it under control. The disruptor, the dominator, right? Disruptor just tells jokes, plays pranks, just does whatever. The dominator controls the conversations, exaggerates knowledge, monopolize conversation because they know more, they know better, they have experience, they're an expert, they have better solutions than anyone else. So again, the job of a leader is to recruit the social and task roles you need in the moment and discourage the dysfunctional roles. Okay, I got a couple more here. You can look at the link here. If you're interested in the Benny and Sheets functional role inventory, the link is right there. I found this stuff super interesting because I've worked with a lot of groups, not just classrooms, but sometimes just friend groups in jobs I've had. All kinds of situations where you 100% you see these dysfunctional roles in front of you and you're like, oh my God, this is Benny and Sheets. So have a look. So when you're applying this, right, again, I want you to be really approaching group work and teamwork in your school program, in your employment, in a conscious way. Don't just wing it. Don't just show up to the group thinking, well, we're just going to talk it out. All right, be really conscious of how you're approaching group work, teamwork. Because if you want to be in a leadership position, you might think of leadership as being something like the person in charge who tells people what to do, who talks more than the others, who is able to, solve all the problems and give an inspirational speech at the end, like Jeff Winger from Community. But that's not really what a leader is. A leader asks themselves these questions here, right? They assess the situation at hand and ask themselves, okay, what roles are needed at this stage in the process? Do we need ideas or do we have ideas we just need to work on? Are we missing information, and who can find this information that we need? Are we needing to come to a compromise over a disagreement? And how do I recruit the roles I need in order to, solve these problems we're having right now? Another thing a leader really needs to do is find the dysfunctional roles and address that dysfunction without damaging group morale. It'll be really tempting to look at the disruptor or the self-confessor and just go like, you need to shut up now. But that kind of display of power isn't always the best way of discouraging a dysfunctional role. Sometimes the disruptor, the person that wants to bring attention to themselves, they might be bored, they might be good at something, you just need to give them something to do that's useful. And you should be constantly reevaluating what are the group needs, what are the group roles that are required. You might need to reorient someone away from a role and towards a different one. And if we have an inventory of roles in our mind and we have a sense of how teamwork functions, how it goes from forming to getting ideas to figuring out how to apply those ideas to performing, you could really tell yourself, here are the roles I need to have right now to get us from point A to point B. And here's a Dilbert cartoon because reasons. I don't know you. Why are you in this meeting? I'm creating the illusion of work by conflating the concepts of attendance with productivity. You should leave. who should I say hates teamwork? Haha, okay. Look, I'll be honest with you. I Google image searched teamwork comic, and that's the best I could come up with. Okay, moving on. So, how to have these successful teams? All right, so a good leader recruits the required roles, discourages dysfunctional ones, and is constantly reevaluating group needs, right, to move them through the stages of the formation process. The successful team is not bigger, but smaller and more diverse. So the most effective groups are going to be smaller, so that, because if they get too big, you have a too many cooks problem. It'll depend on the task, right? But we're looking, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 people, maybe tops. And you're going to want a diverse group. The reason you want a diverse group is because you need to avoid those problems with group dynamics that I identified a few slides ago. Problems like groupthink, problems like conflict avoidance, where nobody's willing to challenge the way things are done, even if the way things are done aren't really good. In fact, there's a lot of empirical evidence that suggests diversity in a team makes it better. And diversity can mean a lot of things. Diversity doesn't just mean diversity in the Hollywood sense of like having people from different backgrounds and cultures. Diversity can also mean generational diversity. It can also mean diversity of educational background, right? A team of just engineers is great, but maybe you need people from other fields as well to make things work. This link here takes you to, hopefully this link is still alive, to a Scientific American article called How Diversity Makes Us Smarter. Right now we have a thing, oh, there it is, it's not loading. Being around people who are different makes us more creative, more diligent, and harder working. So you can kind of look at this article. Let me read to you the in brief here, because I think it's a very compelling argument for the idea that teams work better when there are differences in the group that can bounce off each other. In brief, decades of research by organizational scientists, psychologists, sociologists, economists, so on, show that socially diverse groups, right? For example, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, I would also include educational background, generational background, are more innovative. Seems obvious that a group of people with diverse expertise would be better than a homogeneous group at solving complex problems, but it's less obvious that social diversity should work in the same way, but the science shows that it does. This is not only because people with different backgrounds bring new information. Interacting with individuals who are different forces group members to prepare better, to anticipate alternative viewpoints, and to expect that reaching consensus will take some effort. So there's lots of different ways, apart from expertise, that diversity makes groups better. Other successful teams also agree on the purpose of the group beforehand, and they come to an agreement on procedures. What the goals are, what the decisions are, how you evaluate whether you're reaching your goals, and how you're implementing those decisions. Good groups also have an ability to deal with conflict. They don't avoid conflict, they deal with it, and there are many different ways of dealing with this conflict. Good teams have excellent communication and information sharing. Right? Nobody's withholding, right? They're transparent. And good teams finally are not in competition with each other within the team, but they're collaborating towards a common outcome. So, that's teamwork. Let me also talk a little bit about other soft skills that might be useful in the workplace outside of group contexts and leadership contexts. I want to talk a little bit about people skills in relationship to three things. How to provide feedback, which is something we were talking about a few weeks ago. Also, this technique called amplification, which I'll talk about. And finally, some conflict resolution and then active listening skills. How's everyone doing out there? I know it's 3:40. I've been live for about 40 minutes. I'm going to keep it to an hour, roughly. If everyone's all right, if you don't have any questions, I'm just going to keep going. I'm watching that live chat. I don't know any Gin Blossom songs. I'm very sorry. So here's a really great article from Harvard Business Review. I know it's a resource I've been using again and again in this class. It's just really great for the soft skills that a comm class is really supposed to be teaching to you for your future workplaces. So one of the interesting things that I've really been trying to incorporate in my own teaching, my own pedagogical approach, is how you should be providing feedback to people that you're working with. One view is that feedback is best if it's just really blunt and direct, and it's okay that it's critical. What's interesting that if we actually look at the research on feedback, we find that helping people really get better at a task isn't really about critical feedback or negative feedback. In fact, the real answer takes us in a really different and unexpected direction. So, as the authors say, generally speaking, actual learning doesn't occur by focusing on the negative. Learning happens, quote, when we see how we might do something we're already doing but better, by adding some new nuance or expansion to our existing understanding. Learning rests on our grasp of what we're doing well, not on what we're doing poorly. Let me repeat that. Learning rests on our grasp of what we're doing well, not on what we're doing poorly. We learn most when someone else pays attention to what's working and asks us to cultivate it intelligently. We're often told the key to learning is to get out of our comfort zones, but these findings actually contradict that particular chestnut, that piece of advice. Because if you take us very far out of our comfort zones, our brains stop paying attention to anything other than just surviving the experience. So the idea here is that the problem with blunt critical feedback is that it makes people feel often very defensive, causing their brain to kind of get into the survival mode, to shut down, to feel like the fight or flight reflex to kick in. And also, it does this other thing, which is it focuses on an area where people are particularly lacking a certain kind of expertise. So it's harder to build on anything. So it makes people defensive and focuses in on an area where they might even not know how to improve yet. So critical feedback can really backfire. It's a feedback fire. And so what you want to do if you want to give useful feedback is ask yourself what you're trying to do. What you're hoping is to get people to perform better, how to be more excellent at their task. So one thing that the article suggests, and it's behind a paywall, but just click through here for the full article. What we should do to help people excel is to, as to say, just look for an outcome and then take note of it and point it out. As the article says, right, take note when somebody really leans into a sales pitch, a project runs smoothly, an angry customer calms down, turn to the team member who created that outcome and say, that's good. By doing this, you'll stop the flow for a moment and pull your colleague's attention back towards something she just did that actually really worked. So this seems really counterintuitive because by drawing people's attention to something they're already good at, how can they get better? But the fact is, drawing people attention to things they've done well allows them to incorporate that understanding back in them in a non-defensive way such that they can actually use that to improve other areas. Read the article. It's quite fascinating, actually, in terms of how to give feedback to people. So when you're working in teams, right, make sure you make time to draw people's attention to things that are really working in the team that'll encourage them to do better. There's a great anecdote in a book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow. And let me actually, I really want to recommend this book to you guys. Here it is. Because it's a book that talks about psychological biases in human judgment, and really walks you through the scientific research about various forms of cognitive biases. And there's this great anecdote in the book about Kahneman, the lead author of this book here, and he's consulting with, I think it's the U.S. military, the Air Force. And Kahneman is basically giving this advice that when you're in a leadership position and you're giving feedback to people, you should focus on positive feedback. And the major general, whoever's in charge of training, says that's nonsense, right? Whenever I tell people they did a good job, they start doing worse. And when I tell people they've done a bad job, they start getting better. So what gives? And Kahneman says, well, that's just a function of regression to the mean. And regression to the mean is a technical term in statistics that means that performances usually go back to kind of a baseline average. So if you do something many, many times, you establish your baseline average. And probably if you do really poorly once, you'll probably do it better next time. You're going to go back to your average. And if you do something really well, the next time you're probably going to do a more average one. So what was happening is that the major general in charge of the Air Force was mostly noting when his pilots had a poor performance and said, well, you should do better, you suck. And then the next time they would do better. But of course they would. They would regress to the mean on average anyway. Most people regress back to their baseline performance after a very bad one or a very good one. And of course, if the pilot had a really good performance, they would also regress to the mean next time, because you typically, right, the average just means you go back to that average. And both of these things are what we call outliers in statistics, a really good performance and a really bad performance. But Kahneman is saying, look, you should draw people to the elements of the excellent performance that made it excellent to get that average back up. Because by drawing attention to the negative performance, right, people are going to freeze and be more panicky. But in both cases, you should expect that regression back to the mean. So it might look like critical feedback makes people perform better, but they probably would have performed better no matter what. And likewise, a really good performance is usually followed by an average performance, because people won't have many excellent performances in a row. If you do want people to become more excellent, you should focus on the excellent performance. At least that's what Kahneman suggests, and that's what these HBR article suggests. Sounds about right. Used to feel like Atlas Shrugged looking for John Galt. Yeah. Where is John Galt? Who is John Galt? Let me get back to the slides here. So yeah, again, if you're going to read anything at all this week, click on the link right here. This is a really great article, and it completely upended a lot of the way I teach. I'm still working on integrating some of this stuff. I still have all these bad habits of like, look, this is bad, rather than going like, really nice job here. So have a look at this link. Here's another example of a soft skill called amplification. And it has to do with this notion of diversity. So we saw a few slides ago the Scientific American article on why diverse teams perform better. One of the ways to help them perform better is this skill called amplification, which is to make sure that the diversity in your group is actually being used. So you want to leverage that diversity. This is from the Washington Post. When President Obama took office, 2/3 of his top aides were men, and then women often complained of having to elbow their way into meetings, and when they got in, their voices were sometimes ignored. I've certainly seen this dynamic myself, but female staffers in the Obama administration did this really clever thing. They adopted a strategy they called amplification. It's that when a woman made a key point, other women would repeat it, making sure they gave credit to the author. Right? This forced other people in the room, the men in the room specifically, to recognize the contribution and deny them to claim the chance to claim the idea as their own. I talked about this in my public speaking slides last week, that there's a tendency for some people to uptalk, which is when they end their sentences by talking upwards. Again, that tentativeness in your delivery definitely makes it sound like you're asking a question rather than making a forceful suggestion. So, likewise, if your views tend to get discounted in a meeting, you can work with people to amplify the point and make sure that that diversity actually gets leveraged in your team, thus making the team better. So anyway, it's a really nice article. You can have a look at it. I think it's a nice example of how a specific skill you can use in a context to make your meetings, to make your group work more effectively. Finally, let me talk a little bit about dealing with conflict and the kind of the 6 stages of dealing with conflict. Again, we don't have a textbook for this class officially, but I've been using this one to design the class. So the kind of 6 stages of conflict resolution, kind of go like this. What you're going to want to do to deal with conflict, and there's lots of different strategies in how you're going to implement this. But all these 6 stages are really important no matter how you try and implement them. So if you're dealing with conflict in the group, you're going to want to make sure that people have a chance to speak and air out their issues. Sometimes you could just stop at step 1. Sometimes people just want to be listened to. So listen, and then don't just listen, but understand. Try to adopt their point of view. Try to take their point of view seriously and treat it as a legitimate concern. All right, point 3. Listen, understand, show concern. This is kind of the empathy part of dealing with conflict. Often people never want to be dismissed. By listening, understanding their point of view, and showing concern, you can make half the problem go away. Because people just want to be heard sometimes. Then you try to deal with the problem. You're going to look for common ground. If you have opposed viewpoints between 2 people, maybe there usually is some kind of common ground. Maybe they're using different language. Maybe they have the same values, but disagreements about how to reach and implement those values, which means you should find good problem-solving options before you reach fair agreement. This seems really abstract, but if anybody has kids, this is basically how you're supposed to deal with pretty much any kid that's having an issue. Just go down. You do this to kids. You establish eye contact. You listen, understand, show concern. You might want to mirror the body language, mirror the emotion. You can start showing concern, but also using language that de-escalates the conflict. Gosh, you sound really angry. I would be mad too, bringing it down. If this was happening to me, I'd be pretty frustrated, and I would want to look for a solution. So you're going to de-escalate that using language while showing concern. So you can move from listen, understand, to find problem-solving options and reach fair agreement. Again, culturally speaking, there's lots of different ways that people deal with conflicts. Some people are direct, some people are indirect. If you see this kind of cultural mismatch in conflict resolution, just be aware of it. Successful meetings. Okay, I'm almost done, I promise. So, you're working in a group. Do you need to have a meeting? Probably not. No meeting should be called unless it requires the open discussion of ideas. And then you have to choose who's going to actually be there. Right? How big should your team be? If you're actually going to be doing important decision making and problem solving, 5, maybe fewer, right? 5, 7 people. If you need to just identify a problem and figure out what's happening, what's going wrong, 10 people, you can get that group bigger. Have a useful meeting, you actually have to have a plan going in. You want to distribute lots of information in advance, agenda, participation, how much time it's going to take, what you're actually going to be doing. All this advanced work is what makes the actual meeting useful. And that's how, and you're going to want to review this information at the beginning of the meeting. As I've been saying, a leader doesn't dominate but facilitates. They're the traffic cop. They direct the traffic, they recruit the roles that are needed and discourse the dysfunctional roles, but they don't take over. The diverse team that Scientific American pointed out is only better if everyone's able to contribute. Part of the leader's job might be asking people to wait and calling on others. All right, it's really important you make sure credit is given where it's due for any contributions in a meeting. Otherwise, people will get angry. All right. Generally speaking, don't leave the room and start criticizing people in like informal post-meeting talk that can also lead to more dysfunction later on down the line. Okay, meeting checklist. Why don't I just skip that? We're going on an hour right now as it is already. Okay, let me close by talking about one last thing, which is a little bit ironic. Active listening. It's ironic because the YouTube live stream format is not very Zoom-like. It's more I talk and I keep an eye on the chat box. However, look, if I don't know what your other classes are doing in terms of their online lectures, if they have online lectures, but you can use that comment box for a sec. I'm looking at it right now. Tell me what your other classes are doing. Are you in Zoom? Are you in Bongo Virtual Classroom? Are other professors even doing online lectures? Or are you just gonna on your own with the slides? Let me know. I'm looking at those comments. So, active listening is kind of the last soft skill I want to talk about this week. We've talked about how groups form, about recruiting roles. Right? We've talked about how leadership works in these contexts, how to give feedback, how to amplify your diverse team's voices. And so lots of, I hope, useful skills that you'll be able to use. The last one I want to talk about is active listening. So when you're listening to someone, for example, when you're trying to resolve a conflict, listening is actually harder than you think it is. So what you want to do is don't be distracted, obviously. Be involved. Watch the speaker's body language. You can mirror the speaker's body language. You can lean forward and try and separate what's factual and what's opinion. How people feel from what the facts are. And identify the important facts. In order to do so, you can ask these clarifying questions. Paraphrase what you hear, take notes, right? So in a non-judgmental way, so you mean this? So all these active listening skills will help people feel heard, will help people express their concerns, will help you deal with conflict. So listening, right? To listen, you don't just perceive a message. You have to decode it. You have to interpret it, and you have to ask people whether your interpretation of what they're trying to say is accurate. So you have to make this kind of conscious choice to do this. And there's a big gap, a lot of research shows, between how much time managers and non-managerial employees spend listening versus speaking. Right? Workers spend more time listening, executives spend more time. Sorry, I got those right. Workers spend how much of their communication time listening? 30 to 45%. Executives spend more time listening. So part of being a good leader, good manager is not just speaking, but listening, which is clearly not something I've been doing very well. Adrian says, okay, just posting slides and videos, Zoom live stream. I really dislike this app, Twitch live stream, and then this one. Twitch was something I was thinking about. I kind of ended up with YouTube. It's what I'm comfortable with. Yeah, Zoom, I didn't want to try, but I was thinking about Twitch. All right. So active listening, where receivers demonstrate they have heard and understood a speaker. Here's how you do that. You can paraphrase the content, mirror the speaker's feelings, state your own feelings, ask for information, and offer to help solve the problem, right? So when you want to be active listening with your fellow employees, with your team, with your partner, maybe at home, right? These are all things that can really kind of help you manage conflict and listen to person instead of blocking their communication attempts at you. If you're the one doing the communicating, remember to use your I statements, right? There's a big difference between saying this is bad versus I feel that this is bad. It kind of helps you separate fact from emotion. So that's all very useful things. Okay. Let me just hold on. Handling constructive criticism. Fine, let me just close here, right? So what does active listening actually mean? Let me give you an example. This is all very abstract. Constructive ways to understand, right, criticism. So somebody says, here's a critique. You guys are just stonewalling my requests for information. So you can paraphrase while de-escalating. Oh, I'm hearing that you think we don't give you information you need quickly enough. Check for feelings. You sound pretty angry about it. Check for the inference. So are you saying you need more information from our team? So notice that, right, we're moving from a criticism when we're doing three things. Here's what you actually said. We're not giving you information. There's no request here. This is their statement of what they believe are the facts. Here's the paraphrase of the facts, and then statement of kind of what I think your emotions are about it. And down here is the actual inference. I'm hearing that you need more information. Right, that's the inference. This down here, this question here is technically not here. You have to infer it. You have to kind of guess that it's there. I've been working very hard to get you the information as quickly as possible, which would be, right, the way to kind of respond to it. So active listening does these three things. Paraphrase, right, do an emotion check, and then look for inferences, like what this person actually saying they need, and seeing, right, if you can address that need. That's kind of how you do this active listening thing. So you can handle constructive criticism without getting defensive yourself. Now, usually, sometimes I do these exercises here. Right, identify responses that show active listening too. So we have comments here and then responses. That's something, I'm not going to do this group exercise here. It's something I do in the classroom. But you can look at these two last slides here and see if you can figure out which ones are the responses that show the good kind of active listening and not the blocking response where we're putting a stop to the communication, which is bad conflict resolution. Okay. So, I think that's it for this week. We've gone about an hour. I think, don't neglect this. This is something that's even mildly interesting to you. Don't neglect this exercise here. I think it's a really good exercise. And just as a reminder, let me get right back up here. Your revision assignment was due on Friday, March 27th. I'm going to be grading those as soon as I'm done your employment packages. Then work on your summary research report presentation. Those are the three things I really need for you before the end of the semester. I hope some of these people skills / soft skills were useful to you. I'm really looking forward to seeing your summaries, research reports, and presentations. If you have any questions or concerns about the class, as always, send me an email. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.